Welcome back to World Cup History. My name is Lavender Bai and I am your World Cup historian. We are 6 tournaments into the World Cup history books, and for the first time, the World Cup is happening in a Nordic country. To date, this is the only time this has ever happened. Don't really know why, but that's a fun fact for you. In Sweden's Rosunda Stadium, a 17-year-old boy is crying in the middle of the football pitch. Absolutely sobbing. Just a mess. Weeping. He cannot even stand up when his teammates surround him, and the goalkeeper has to lift him off the ground. When he eventually does get to his feet, the entire stadium erupts around them. Brazil have just beaten the host nation 5-2 in the World Cup final, finally redeeming themselves after years and years of heartache. And that 17-year-old boy had just scored twice. Even the Swedish fans, who had just watched their team lose a home World Cup final, can't help but give the Brazilians a standing ovation. The Swedish right-back at the time, Ovar Bergmark, later said, at that time it would have been better to sit in the stands and enjoy their skills instead of being exposed to them. The opposing defender Sigge Parling said, after Pelé scored the 5th goal, I didn't want to mark him anymore. I just wanted to applaud him. That boy's name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. The world, however, would come to know him as Pelé, and he would go on to leave a legacy in the sport that remains unmatched. And just 3 weeks earlier, a psychologist had told the Brazilian coaching staff that he was too immature to play. This is the story of the 1958 World Cup, the tournament that changed football forever. And it begins not in Sweden, but in the ruins of what happened 8 years before. But before we get to that, let's set the scene. It's 1958 and we are 13 years clear of the deadliest war in human history. We are in a new normal. So nations are slowly beginning to rebuild with varying levels of success, while we're all trying to kind of work out what comes next. The Cold War is in full swing. 8 months before the World Cup kicks off, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, which is both a big win for space exploration and, psychological control. The rest of the world feels like if the Soviets can put a satellite into space, they can probably put a nuke anywhere on the planet. So kids in America are doing nuke drills, and by the time the World Cup begins in July, America would launch NASA as a direct response. We are in the space race, baby.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Put the timeline into further perspective for you. In March 1958, 3 months before the World Cup kicks off, Elvis Presley reports for army duty. For teenagers across the world, this feels like the establishment reaching in and taking something back. Rock and roll had arrived. The old order was being challenged everywhere. In music, in culture, in politics, and in football. In Europe, the situation kind of depends on who you ask. West Germany's economy is booming, but then Britain is still on food rations. France is politically unstable as all hell, but Sweden, who had stayed neutral in both world wars and had remained largely untouched as a result, is thriving. They've got universal healthcare, cheap housing, they're socially democratic, and they are welcoming to the world. Which is why it's lucky that they had the World Cup. And it would be in Sweden that 16 nations would come together to play 35 matches. And it would be in Sweden where a 17-year-old boy from Brazil would change the world. But before we get into the football, there is one more thing you should know about the world in June 1958. 4 months before the World Cup, on February 6, a British European Airways flight carrying the Manchester United squad crashed on takeoff from a slush-covered runway in Munich. 8 players would die in this tragedy, one of the most exciting young squads in European football gone in minutes. Duncan Edwards was 21 years old. He was considered by many who watched him to be the kind of player that could grow up to be one of the greatest English footballers who would ever live. He ended up dying of his injuries 15 days after the crash. Then there's Matt Busby, who survived the crash but would spend months in hospital. So England arrived in Sweden in June 1958 carrying that grief. The squad that should have been built around Edwards wasn't. They drew 0-0 with Brazil in the group stage, the first goalless draw in World Cup history, and went home before the quarterfinals. That 0-0 game has a footnote worth noting. Brazil would play that match without Pele and Garrincha, both rested at the time. In the next game, Fiola put them both in together against the Soviet Union, and they would never be separated again. Turns out the most boring match in World Cup history directly caused the most consequential selection decision of the tournament. So Brazil in 1958 is still carrying the emotional weight of 1950. It's been 8 years since they lost the World Cup in a game they only needed to draw. 8 years since they left a 200,000 person stadium dead silent. And 8 years since they exiled their goalkeeper for the rest of his life. Pelé, a child when he won the World Cup in 1958, but even more juvenile when they lost in 1950, recalled the loss feeling like, quote, like the end of a war, with Brazil the loser and many people dead. They went into 1954 in their bright new yellow shirts and were beaten in the quarterfinals by Hungary in the Battle of Bern. A match so violent that 3 players were sent off, the Hungarian manager needed stitches in his face, and the Brazilian journalists invaded the pitch before the final whistle. They went home again. 2 tournaments, 0 trophies, and a shame that shattered national pride. 1958 was going to be different. It had to be. With substantial support from Brazil's government, they prepared for Sweden like no team had prepared for a World Cup before. A delegation flew to Sweden a year in advance to assess 25 training sites. A scout was sent to Europe to watch qualifying opponents. The squad brought a coach, a supervisor, a doctor, a dentist, a psychologist, an administrator, a scout, and a fitness trainer. So the team doctor, Hilton Gosling, was assigned to choose the hotel. He considered distance from the stadiums, quality of training facilities, and the local climate. He also reportedly requested that the hotel's female staff be replaced with men so the players wouldn't be distracted. The nearby nudist beach was apparently not flagged as a concern. Take that with a grain of salt, I guess. And then there was the psychologist. So Professor João Carvalhais was hired to conduct psychological assessments on every player in the squad. Players were asked to draw sketches of people and answer questions to help him assess whether they should be selected. Okay, so there's a little bit of a caveat here. His assessment was influenced by a belief that fair-skinned players provided emotional stability to a team, which was a weird theory. His assessments also concluded that 2 players were mentally unfit to play the tournament. Shockingly, those 2 players were Pele and Garrincha. About Pele, he wrote, "Pele is obviously infantile. He lacks the necessary fighting spirit." About Garrincha, he concluded he was not responsible enough to play. Coach Fiola listened to the report. He nodded and said, "You may be right. The thing is, you don't know anything about football. If Pele's knee is ready, he plays." That decision would change World Cup history forever and would go down as one of the best calls by a manager to date. And here's the thing about Carvalhais. His belief that fair-skinned players provided emotional stability wasn't unusual in 1958. This was the dominant view. A French journalist in 1938 had written that Brazilians had marvelous natural gift but lacked intelligence for team football. That view had calcified over 20 years into something that Brazilian football half internalized. The debate about whether to field a predominantly black squad at the World Cup was real. It was documented and it was happening at the highest levels of Brazilian football in the years before 1958. Carvalhais wasn't an outlier. He was the establishment view given a job title and a clipboard. Thankfully, the coach ignored him and in doing so made a decision that went far beyond football tactics. But before we meet Pele properly, we need to meet Garrincha, because Garrincha might be the most extraordinary human being to ever play football, and his story deserves to be told on its own. Manuel Francisco dos Santos was born in 1933 in Pau Grande, a small factory town in Rio de Janeiro. His brother gave him the nickname Garrincha after a small, pathetic, and essentially useless bird because of his misshapen legs, which was the result of childhood polio. If you think your siblings are mean to you, imagine you contract polio and then you get an awful nickname as a result. So both of his legs curved to one side, his spine was shaped like a capital S, one leg was 6 centimeters shorter than the other. Doctors diagnosed that without surgery, he would be confined to a wheelchair forever. Ultimately, he had the surgery, and not only could he walk, he could play football, like really well. His father was an alcoholic, and Garrincha was also illiterate. In psychological tests, he was classed as below primary school age with zero aggression. He even spelt the word athlete wrong on his form. He also drank a bottle of Brazilian rum every single day, including sometimes before games. And he fathered 14 children to 5 different women. He walked so Nick Cannon could run, I guess. And he was the greatest right-winger who ever lived. Brazilian football expert Tim Vickery described his playing style. He would run a little bit, stop, run a little bit, stop. Very, very often, they would double up or even triple up to mark him. So you have a line of people, but they never all go in at the same time. It's a little bit like watching a Bruce Lee film where he's able to fight off one and then dribble around the next. So the first time the world would see what Garrincha could do was June 15, 1958. Brazil versus the Soviet Union. So Garrincha had never played a World Cup match before, but within 3 minutes of kickoff, he had beaten 2 Soviet defenders, drawn the goalkeeper, and hit the post. The Soviet players kind of just looked at each other. Nobody had prepared them for this. Nobody could have prepared them for this. Brazil would go on to win 2-0, and journalists in the press box that day wrote that the opening 3 minutes were the best football they had ever seen. Pelé might have got the headlines, but Garrincha got the result. Garrincha was told he would never walk, let alone play football. He couldn't even spell athlete, but he became one of the world's greatest. He was told by a psychologist that he was too irresponsible to play the World Cup, but he went on to win it. This was a man who refused to take no for an answer, and that's probably why he was so brilliant. And when you combine him with Pelé, the pair were football gods. And interestingly enough, Brazil never lost a game that both men played. Not even once. That is an incredible stat. So Pelé was born on October 23, 1940. He was the son of Fluminense footballer Dondinho, whose own career had been cut short by injury. Growing up poor, he shined shoes as a child to earn money and played football in the streets with a sock stuffed with rags. He joined Santos at 15, and by 16 he was the top scorer in the Sao Paulo State Championship and had debuted for the national team. He scored in his debut match against Argentina and remains the youngest goal scorer in Brazil's history. By the time the 1958 World Cup came around, he was 17 with a damaged knee, rigorously applying boiling hot towels every day to try and get fit in time. While the psychologist warned he was too infantile to play, the Brazilian coach was bullish on this 17-year-old and said if the knee is ready, he plays. At a training camp in Sweden, hordes of young Swedish girls gathered at the gates every day to ask for his autograph. Every reporter wanted to interview him, but surprisingly, at just 17 years of age, he was able to keep his focus. Football was more important than any amount of fame. Pelé made his World Cup debut against the Soviet Union on June 15, 1958. He was 17 years and 239 days old, the youngest player to ever appear at the World Cup. Against Wales in the quarterfinal, he received the ball with his back to the goal, flicked it over the defender's head, turned, and volleyed it before it touched the ground. Less than a year after his national team debut, he became the tournament's youngest ever goal scorer. And then against France in the semi-final, he scored a hat-trick, the youngest hat-trick scorer in history. And then in the final against Sweden, he scored twice. His first goal, in which he flicked the ball over a defender before volleying it into the corner of the net, was selected as one of the best goals in the history of the World Cup. He then sealed the deal with another header in stoppage time to end the game, becoming the youngest World Cup winner and World Cup final goal scorer in history. This man was collecting records like Pokemons. Immediately after the goal, he collapsed in emotion in the middle of the field, just absolutely sobbing. With their 1958 win in Sweden, Pele and Garrincha had finally etched Brazil's names into the history books once more. They rewrote the narrative that had been formed from their prior appearances and cemented their position as a force to be reckoned with in international football. Never again could Brazil be seen as inferior to the European nations. The psychologist Carvalhais had concluded that fair-skinned players provided emotional stability. That wasn't private bias, that was the explicit rationale in his official report, taken seriously by the federation that hired him. But the two players he said were mentally unfit were the ones that won the World Cup and then won it again in 1962. And like I said, Brazil never lost a match with both of them playing. So obviously Pele's debut is the headline of the tournament looking back. Brazil really dominated every part of 1958. But because their story is so great, so many other stories get lost in the noise. 58 is the only World Cup in history where all four British home nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all qualified for the same tournament. And interestingly, the two expected to go furthest, England and Scotland, got grouped, while the two that nobody gave a chance, Wales and Northern Ireland, reached the quarterfinals. Wales' qualification was particularly strange. Let me explain. So they finished second in their qualifying group, and when FIFA needed a team to play off against Israel after their three opponents refused, Wales was up. They beat Israel, who had qualified without actually having to play a match, and were on their way to Sweden. And they made it pretty far until they faced off against Brazil and lost 1-0 after a Pelé goal. This would be the last time they would see a World Cup until 2022. And then there's Italy, who failed to qualify for the World Cup for the first time in their history. The country that had won the World Cup in 1934 and 1938 were knocked out in qualifying by Northern Ireland. This is still one of the most shocking qualification failures in World Cup history. Nowadays, Italy bottling World Cup qualification feels quite normal, having missed the last three tournaments. And then there was Hungary, who arrived in a totally different position than the last tournament. The golden team that got painfully humbled at the last World Cup was in absolute shambles now. Their greatest players were scattered around the world and their national team was far from golden. Ultimately, they got grouped after losing a playoff to Wales. This was also the first time that Argentina have been at a World Cup since 1934. And boy, oh boy, they were ready to redeem themselves. But they did anything but. They finished last in their group after losing 6-1 to Czechoslovakia, which remains the worst defeat to date in a game known as Desastre de Sucia, or Disaster of Sweden. Prior to the game, they were sitting second in the group, but Czechoslovakia said, "You better check yourself before you wreck yourself," and sent them packing. And then it gets even more crazy because upon their return to Argentina, they had to land in a local field rather than at the airport because locals were looking for them with sticks and stones. And like, you know what they say about sticks and stones? They will break your bones. And then there was Just Fontaine. So Fontaine was a last-minute inclusion in the French squad. Born in Marrakech to a French father and a Spanish mother, he was largely unknown outside of the French league going into the tournament. He actually had to play in borrowed boots after his own were damaged in training. He went on to score 13 goals in just 6 matches. This is the most scored by a single player in one tournament, a record he still holds to this day. He scored in every single match he played in this tournament, including a hat-trick in the first game to really set the pace. And then he went on to net 4 against West Germany in the 3rd place match. This man was not fucking around. To put this into context for you, Argentina scored 15 goals in the entire 2022 World Cup campaign. Fontaine nearly beats this on his own. Pretty good for a last-minute inclusion, if you ask me. He remains the 4th leading all-time World Cup goal scorer despite playing only one tournament. But sadly for him, there was no golden boot in 1958, so his trophy for netting the most goals was, quite literally, a rifle from a Swedish newspaper. Unfortunately, his career would end just 2 years later when he snapped his leg in a game in 1960. Okay, gore warning, but the French goalkeeper at the time said the sound of his bone snapping was so loud that he could hear it from the other end of the pitch. When asked in 2006 who was the greatest finisher of all time, Fontaine replied without hesitation. Fontaine. You have to applaud the confidence. But back to the final. So Pelé collapses in tears, his teammates surround him, the Swedish fans, who have just watched their own team lose a home World Cup 5-2, can't help but give him a standing ovation. Pelé later said, "I was just 17. I didn't really understand what had happened. I just felt this enormous weight and I couldn't stop crying." Honestly, mood. And this is fair enough. What he was feeling at the time was the weight of 8 years of Brazil's grief being lifted off his shoulders. This meant more than just one game, more than just one tournament. This was the rebirth of Brazil's football legacy. This tournament had literally destroyed Brazil in the past. It had their goalkeeper exiled. It ruined their reputation. But now, at just 17 in a few short weeks of football, Pelé had given the nation something to be proud of again. Swedish social democracy was at its height in 1958, and the crowd's response of applauding a Brazilian team made up of mostly black players in a final they had just lost was noted internationally. It wasn't the norm, but it said something about what football at its best can make people feel. This makes me think back to Jules Rimet's North Star in life. This idea that football could unite a people better than anything. And I think Sweden's standing ovation sums that up pretty perfectly. Back in Brazil, the win didn't just repair the wound of 1950. It settled something that had been contested for years. From 1958 onwards, the debate about whether Brazil should field a whiter team effectively ended. It became a moot point. Football had done something that politics and policy hadn't managed. It forced a reckoning with who Brazil actually was and what that was worth. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that it mattered. 1958 remains the only time a non-European country has won the World Cup on European soil. No team outside of Europe has managed to do it since. And Brazil did it with a 17-year-old boy that they were told was too immature to play, and a winger with bent legs who was told he'd probably never walk. But I think the most important thing about this is they also had a manager who looked at a psychologist's report and said, "You don't know anything about football." Garrincha died in 1983, aged 49, of cirrhosis. He died broke and an alcoholic. His savings completely gone. He was playing exhibition matches for $50 in the end. That was how it ended for the angel with the bent legs. Pelé went on to win the World Cup 2 more times. He became the most famous athlete on earth. He died in December 2022, aged 82. And both men died having never lost a game they played together. Next up, we have Chile 1962. An earthquake, the most violent World Cup match in history, and whether one man could win a World Cup entirely on his own.